Hey, welcome to our channel. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss our latest content.
The lock on my therapy room door turned with a familiar, muted click, a sound I had orchestrated thousands of times. It was part of a routine, a small ritual of beginnings and endings that composed the very rhythm of my life. For 20 years, that sound had been a barrier, separating the ordered world of my practice from the unpredictable currents of my own life. A life I believed was just as ordered, just as controlled. When Caleb Vance entered, he carried more than just his usual winter coat. He seemed to be wearing the weight of the city's gray, oppressive sky. The circles under his eyes, which I had noted in previous sessions as signs of anxiety, were now bruised, dark smudges on his pale skin. His gaze was fixed on a point somewhere beyond the walls of my office, as if he were watching a ship disappear over a distant horizon. A ship he was meant to be on. I settled into my leather chair, the worn material groaning softly, another familiar sound in the sanctuary of controlled confession. I let the silence sit between us for a moment before speaking. "Caleb," I began, my voice even, measured. "How have you been since we last spoke?" He didn't answer right away. His hands, long and restless, found the zipper on his jacket and pulled it up and down. A nervous, metallic rasp that filled the quiet. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the kind you take before diving into cold water. Then, his eyes still locked on the floorboards, he spoke. "I need to get something off my chest, doctor." His voice was a whisper, so quiet it felt like a secret he was telling himself, and I was merely an intruder, eavesdropping on his soul. "I'm here to listen," I said, my pen poised over a fresh page in my notebook. And then he began. He told me he had met a woman. The connection, he said, was instant, a spark in the dim light of a crowded cafe. As he spoke, his words were a strange cocktail of exhilaration and shame. He described her with a reverence that bordered on worship. She was older, he admitted, his gaze flickering up to meet mine for a fraction of a second before falling again. And she was married. Despite that, despite everything, they became involved. At first, it was just talking. Conversations that stretched for hours, where he felt, seen, truly seen, for the first time in his life. Then came the clandestine meetings in parks and quiet coffee shops. And then, inevitably, it transformed into something more. A relationship he himself called wrong, but one he already felt powerless to escape. I just listened. As was my practice, I jotted down keywords. Instant connection. Guilt. Forbidden. Powerless. My role was not to judge. It was to hold up a mirror, to provide a space where the tangled threads of his emotions could be gently unraveled. I encouraged him to continue, and he seemed to find relief in the act of speaking, as if the words themselves were poison being drawn from a wound. "I'm torn," he confessed, his voice cracking. "I'm torn between this feeling I can't live without, and knowing I'm hurting someone, a man I've never even met." He said the woman seemed unhappy in her marriage, but she never spoke ill of her husband. She simply described him as absent, distracted, someone who no longer noticed her presence in a room, a ghost in her own home. During the session, Caleb revealed he had tried to end it. He distanced himself, deleted her number, sworn to himself it was over. But all it took was a single message from her, a single sentence, and he would surrender completely. "I've never felt a connection like this with anyone," he said, the desperation raw in his voice. "And even though I know it has an expiration date, I can't let her go." I kept my attention focused, my posture unchanged. This was a delicate situation, certainly, but not an uncommon one. Extramarital affairs were emotionally complex webs, and I had heard dozens of similar stories over the years. My job was to guide the patient through the labyrinth of their own making. But what made this day different was the intensity. The way Caleb spoke, there was an overwhelming sense of being consumed, of being utterly lost to what he was experiencing. And there was something else, a strange familiarity. It was in the specific terms he used, the way he described their encounters, the exact words the woman had said to him, even certain expressions she used. Little turns of phrase that felt like echoes in my mind, but the thoughts were too confusing, too fragmented for any real conclusion. It was just a flicker of clinical intuition, nothing more. He was a vulnerable patient. He was trying to understand the dynamic that held him captive. It was too early for judgment. What mattered was creating a safe space for him to process, to become aware of the consequences, and perhaps, to find a healthier path for himself. Near the end of the session, He said something that snagged in my mind, sharp as a fishhook. "When I'm with her," he said, looking at me directly for the first time, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I feel this rare thing. Genuine listening. With her, I don't have to pretend. She sees me for who I really am." The statement hung in the air between us. I had heard something very similar before, I was sure of it, but in a completely different context. I couldn't place it. The session concluded with a sincere thank you from Caleb. He seemed lighter, as if the confession had lifted a physical weight from his shoulders. As he left, he turned at the door. "I really hope I can do the right thing, Doctor." I remained in my chair for a few moments after he'd gone, staring at the closed door. It felt as if something inside me had been activated, a low hum of unease that had no clear form yet. The story had moved me, not for the salacious details, but for the raw, emotional honesty of the patient. But there was more. I felt intrigued. Not out of jealousy or anger, not yet. Just a vague, unsettling sensation that there were more layers to this story than what had been told that morning. I continued my day, seeing other patients, discussing other lives, other pains. But inside my head, the image of Caleb describing that woman returned like an echo. I am an experienced professional. I know that sometimes clinical intuition captures what reason hasn't yet comprehended. And on that Thursday, I felt something was taking shape in the shadows of my mind, even if I didn't yet know what it was. The next few weeks passed in a blur of routine. Sessions with other patients, paperwork, the quiet commute home. But Caleb's story had become a low, constant hum beneath the surface of my own life. In our sessions, he continued to speak of her. He described the curve of her smile, the way she'd brush a stray piece of hair from her face. He mentioned a particular blue dress she wore, one that made her eyes look like the deep ocean. He talked about her love for old books, for the scent of rain on pavement, for a small, obscure cafe on the other side of town called The Daily Grind. Each detail was a small, sharp pinprick. I saw that same blue dress hanging in the closet at home. Eleanor had bought it a few months ago. She loved old books. Our house was filled with them. And the Daily Grind, that was her place. The place she went to get away from it all, as she'd say with a tired smile. The therapist in me analyzed the pattern. Coincidence, my rational mind insisted. These are common details, common interests. Boston is a big city, but not that big. You are projecting, Elias. You are letting a patient's narrative bleed into your personal life. It's a classic sign of countertransference. I recited the clinical terms to myself like a prayer, a shield against the encroaching dread. The husband in me refused to see the picture, but the evidence kept mounting, piece by agonizing piece. One evening, Eleanor and I were having dinner. An uncomfortable silence had settled between us, as it often did these days. I was trying to talk about my day, to bridge the growing chasm between us. She was just pushing food around her plate. "I just feel like sometimes," I said, searching for the right words, "we forget to nourish what we have." Eleanor looked up, a flicker of something in her eye. "Annoyance? Recognition? Nourish it?" she repeated, her tone flat. "That's a nice word, Elias. Did you read that in one of your books?" 2 days later, in my office, Caleb was describing a recent conversation with his lover. He was wrestling with his guilt, and she had tried to comfort him. "She told me," Caleb said, his voice soft with memory, "that sometimes people in long relationships, they just forget to nourish what they have. That love doesn't die, it just gets neglected." Oh, the exact same phrase, nourish it. My blood ran cold. I kept my face a mask of professional neutrality, but behind it, a silent scream was building. It was a coincidence. It had to be. My interactions with Eleanor became a clinical observation. I watched her as she texted, her phone always angled slightly away from me. I noted the late nights she said were spent with friends, the vague answers about her day. For years, I had interpreted these as signs of her independence, of the natural evolution of a long marriage where two lives run on parallel, but separate, tracks. Now, I saw them through a different lens. The lens Caleb had given me. Every word he spoke in our sessions felt like a clue in a mystery I was terrified to solve. The professional in me kept taking notes, nodding, offering therapeutic guidance. "How does that make you feel, Caleb? What do you think is driving that behavior?" The husband in me was suffocating. I felt like a detective investigating my own murder, forced to listen calmly as the killer described the weapon, the motive, the final moments. all without knowing I was the victim. The conflict was tearing me apart. My office, once a sanctuary of order, had become a torture chamber, and every tick of the clock on the wall sounded like a countdown to a detonation I could feel building deep inside my own chest. The day the world ended, it began like any other. The air was crisp, the clock on the wall marked exactly 3 p.m. Caleb arrived for his session. He seemed different today. Lighter. Almost hopeful. He greeted me with a discreet smile and settled into the patient's chair. He spoke casually at first, about his week, about work. He said he had thought a lot about everything. He was tired of living a hidden life. Maybe it was time to put an end to the affair. Or maybe not, because part of him, he confessed, still wanted to fight for it. I just listened. My jaw clenched so tight I felt a sharp pain radiate up to my temple. My pen was still in my hand, but I hadn't written a single word. I couldn't. My hand was shaking. Then he said something that changed everything. You know, it's funny, he mused, a small, wistful smile on his face. Last night, I dreamed about her. She was in that same cafe where we first met. She was wearing that blue dress. The same one she wore the night she told me her marriage felt so cold. He paused, looking at me as if seeking validation for the beauty of his memory. And then he spoke the name. Eleanor Thorne is an incredible woman, he said, his voice filled with a sincere, heartbreaking admiration. She made me believe in love again. Silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but filled with the deafening roar of a universe collapsing. The air in the room became thick, unbreathable. My pen froze mid-stroke on the notepad. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Eleanor Thorne. He hadn't just said her first name. He had said the full name. My name. Our name. He spoke it with the casual intimacy of a lover and the profound ignorance of a stranger, all at once. He said her name, my wife's name, inside my office, as if speaking of someone I could never possibly know. The professional facade I had spent 2 decades perfecting shattered into a million pieces. There was no Dr. Thorne anymore. There was only a husband, betrayed in the most surreal and cruel way imaginable. He had been describing intimate moments with my wife. He had been quoting her words back to me. He had been unknowingly confessing his affair with my wife, to her husband. And I had been taking notes. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my pen down on the desk. The small click echoed in the crushing silence. I stood up from my chair. My body felt heavy, as if I were moving through water. I walked to the door, my movements stiff, robotic. I unlocked it without saying a word. I held it open and waited, my gaze fixed on the wall behind him. Caleb looked up, his expression shifting from wistful nostalgia to utter confusion. Did I say something wrong, doctor? I finally turned to look at him, but my eyes didn't truly see him. They saw a ghost, a symbol of my own failure. The session is over, I said, my voice a low, gravelly thing I didn't recognize. And it will be our last. He hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as if to ask a question he couldn't form. Then, seeing the cold finality in my posture, he grabbed his coat and departed, glancing back over his shoulder as if trying to understand the sudden, violent shift in the atmosphere. As soon as he crossed the threshold, I shut the door. The latch, clicking into place, felt like the closing of a tomb. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the wood grain of the door that separated me from the rest of the world. My first call was to my secretary. Cancel all my appointments for the rest of the day, I said, my voice devoid of all emotion. And for tomorrow. I didn't offer an explanation. I couldn't. I went back into my office and locked the door from the inside. I stood there for minutes, my hands resting flat on the cool surface of my desk, my knuckles white. There was no more room for clinical rationalizations. No more talk of countertransference or professional boundaries. The truth had been thrown into the middle of my life, unfiltered, brutal, and undeniable. The drive home was an automaton's journey. I don't remember the traffic, the lights, the turns. My mind was a maelstrom of images. Caleb's face, earnest and confessional. Eleanor's face, distant and sad. My own face in the reflection of my office window, a hollow-eyed stranger. When I reached our house, dusk was settling, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. The light in the living room was on. Through the window, I could see her, Eleanor. She was on the couch, scrolling through her phone, a half-smile on her face as she watched some show on the television. Pretending everything was normal. The sight of that normality, it was the cruelest cut of all. I opened the door and entered. She looked up, her smile faltering slightly at the sight of my expression. "Elias, you're home early." I didn't answer. I just stood there, observing her for a few seconds. The woman I had spent half my life with. The woman who had become a complete stranger. "Caleb Vance is my patient," I said. The words were firm, heavy. They dropped into the quiet room like stones into a still pond, and the ripples spread instantly. Her phone slipped from her hand, clattering onto the hardwood floor. She froze, her face draining of all color. It was as if the ground beneath her feet had simply disappeared. It took her a few seconds to react, to process the impossible collision of her two separate worlds. "What?" she whispered, her voice a thread. "You heard me." Her hands flew to her face, and a choked sob escaped her lips. The sound was ugly, guttural. She tried to approach me, her hands outstretched, but I took a step back, a flinch, an involuntary act of self-preservation. Her reaching hands fell to her sides. "How long has this been going on?" My voice was cold, a surgeon's voice. "Elias, please, let me explain." "How long, Eleanor?" I repeated, the name tasting like ash in my mouth. She hesitated, took a deep, shuddering breath, and then she broke down completely. 3 months, she wept. It started by accident. It wasn't supposed to happen. Then it just got harder and harder to stop. I didn't plan any of this. I swear, Lon. I didn't want to hear the excuses, the justifications, the narrative of her pain that had led her to him. All I could hear was the echo of Caleb's voice in my office, describing my wife. I crossed the hallway in silence, went to our bedroom, my bedroom, now, and opened the closet. I grabbed a backpack, a bag I hadn't used in years. I began stuffing clothes into it. Shirts, socks, toiletries, my wallet, my phone charger. Each movement was mechanical, detached. I was watching myself from a great distance. When I returned to the living room, Eleanor was slumped against the wall, crying without strength, without hope. She watched me, her eyes wide with panic and despair. "Are you really leaving?" she whispered. "Like this?" I zipped the backpack and slung it over my shoulder. I didn't look at her. I couldn't. If I looked at her, I was afraid the dam of my own control would break. "Nothing you can say will change this," I replied, my voice flat. And then I left. I closed the door slowly behind me, without saying anything else. The click of the lock sounded again. Not the click of a beginning or an ending in a therapy session. This was the click of the end of my life as I knew it. The weeks that followed were a cold, gray fog. The silence between Eleanor and me became a legal distance, a chasm negotiated by lawyers who spoke in terms of assets and settlement. The divorce process began before either of us had the courage to exchange a single word. Our shared life was being dismantled, piece by piece, reduced to formalities in court documents. There was nothing left to say. Everything had already been said, or destroyed, through the choices we had made. Just when I thought the worst was over, when I thought I could begin to navigate the wreckage, a new bomb arrived. It came by mail, a crisp, white envelope with my name typed in bold, black letters. It was an official notice. Caleb Vance had filed a lawsuit against me. The charge, moral damages, and a breach of therapeutic confidentiality. My hands trembled as I read the document. It was clear, precise, and devastating. It cited sections of the American Psychological Association's Ethics Code, pointing out that the patient had shared intimate information in a protected, therapeutic environment. It claimed that this information had been utilized against him outside the session for my own personal benefit, namely, the dissolution of my marriage. The lawsuit also referenced a federal privacy act, stating that Dr. Elias Thorne had violated a patient's fundamental right to psychological privacy. The ground, which had already crumbled beneath me, now seemed to tremble again. I had lost my wife. Now I was at risk of losing my career. My reputation, built over 20 years of dedication and strict ethical conduct, was about to be publicly questioned and potentially destroyed. All of it because of a relationship that should have never existed, a secret that had found its way into the one place it was supposed to be safe. For days, I hesitated. My lawyer advised me to consider settling, to accept the lawsuit in silence, avoid the public exposure, and let the scandal fade with time. But when I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I saw a man who had already lost too much. I saw a man whose very identity was being stripped away. He had taken my wife. He would not take my name. I decided to act. I filed a civil suit against Caleb Vance. My lawsuit was based on state law protecting the marital pact. I argued that the patient had directly and consciously interfered in my marriage, causing irreversible emotional and psychological damage. This wasn't just infidelity, my lawyer contended. This was the deliberate manipulation of a therapeutic relationship and the targeted destruction of a commitment that had lasted for years. From that point on, everything transformed into a dirty war. Our lives were no longer our own. They belonged to the lawyers, to the courts. They began dissecting every detail. Old emails were unearthed. Text messages were submitted as evidence. Medical records, meeting dates, call histories, schedules, our entire existence was laid bare and tagged as exhibits. Eleanor was called to testify. The embarrassment, the shame, the private pain of our shattered marriage was formally exposed in the reports attached to the case. The matter gained attention in the city's legal corridors. The respected therapist was now the subject of a double scandal, marital and professional. Caleb, meanwhile, became the center of public accusations, painted as a predator who destroyed a family and manipulated his own therapy sessions for emotional gain. What had once been a private crisis, confined to the four walls of my office and my home, had now become a public spectacle documented in dozens of pages, filled with signatures and deadlines. Our pain was no longer ours alone. It was documentation. It was protocol. It was expert analysis. Justice was at stake, yes. But above all, the truth of each person was being confronted in an arena with no emotional protection. It wasn't just a lawsuit anymore. It was the public demolition of 3 lives. In the months that the cases dragged through the courts, we each followed a silent path of isolation. It was as if the scandal had placed us in separate cages, where the only sound was the echo of our own choices. I learned through the legal proceedings that Eleanor had left Boston 2 weeks after our formal separation. She went to Denver to stay with her sister. She left behind the apartment, the furniture, even the plants she had so carefully tended. She left behind the ghost of our life together. I imagined her there, trying to maintain some routine, helping with her nieces and nephews, reading books to escape the silence. I imagined the nights when the weight of it all would come crashing back down. I imagined her wanting to call me, to explain, to apologize, but being silenced by a shame that was now a permanent guest within her. Caleb, too, withdrew. He quit his job. He disappeared from social media. He was trapped in his own apartment, the days blurring into one another. The vibrant, if troubled, man who had sat in my office was gone, his energy drained by a guilt he could no longer pretend not to feel. I learned later, through depositions, that he had started taking sleeping pills, that he had recurring nightmares of our final session, of the look on my face when he spoke Eleanor's name, a constant reminder that even if he claimed he didn't know, deep down, he knew he was crossing a dangerous line. He had simply chosen to ignore it. And me, I, who had always been the man of reason, of discipline, of restraint, I finally collapsed internally. I tried to keep seeing my patients. I tried to maintain the same, steady, balanced posture, but my eyes no longer reflected security. They reflected loss. One day, while listening to a patient talk about emotional abandonment in her own marriage, I felt my body begin to shake. The words she was using, they were my words. Her pain was my pain. The professional barrier I had so carefully constructed had evaporated. After the session, I turned off my phone and spent more than an hour just staring into nothing. It was on that day that I realized I needed help. I sought out a therapist in a neighboring town, a man I didn't know, to avoid comments or judgments. In the first sessions, I barely spoke. I just listened to the quiet. I breathed. Then, slowly, I began to talk. I talked about the marriage, about the pride I felt in keeping things working, in providing a stable life. I talked about how much I believed that a secure routine was a synonym for love. And then, for the first time, I began to admit what I had always hidden, even from myself, that I had distanced myself from Eleanor long before Caleb ever appeared, that I had become a spectator in my own marital life, that I had traded the role of a husband for that of an emotional technician, analyzing her moods instead of sharing her feelings. I confessed that, although it seemed absurd, a part of me understood why she sought